So I suppose it's no surprise then that he's been so adaptable for film and radio and television.
No, not at all. I mean, it's fairly obvious it started, of course, in his own time, and much to his indignation, because there was no copyright law in those days, so you had half a dozen or more versions of the Christmas Carol being played in the London theatres and up and down the country, within weeks almost of the book coming out. So he was, in his own time, constantly adapted, and there was not very much he could do about it. I mean, he got very angry about it. Less so with his later novels, because Our Mutual Friend and so on, they weren't so easy to adapt to the stage, but they were adapted. In early cinema, he was one of the first of the great novelists to be plundered. I mean, around 1912 or so, there was a chap called Thomas Bentley who was making film after film, silent films, of course, of even Barnaby Rudge and Tale of Two Cities with great crowd scenes. And, of course, there have been endless films of Dickens. The two great David Lean ones, I think, of Oliver Twist and Great Expectations, stand out as the greatest, in my book anyway, the greatest Dickens films ever made. And lots of adaptations. I mean, just think of the success of Oliver, the musical.
Dickens had a very clear sense of the profession of writing, of what it meant to be a man of letters. It was a profession which had dignity about it. Do you think he really helped to shape the whole conception of what a literary career meant for the subsequent century?
Well, there's no doubt that the dignity of literature, to use the phrase that he enforced to use, was tremendously important to him. And his great opposite here was Thackeray, who talked about it as a trade. And Dickens considered himself and writers, serious writers, to be great artists, and he always contrasted his century with the 18th century, where even such great men as Samuel Johnson and so on were dependent on patrons, aristocratic patrons and so forth, whereas for Dickens the only patron should be the public. It's a difficult one in a sense. I mean, he certainly had this great sense of that's why he refused knighthoods and so forth and so on, and just wanted the plain words Charles Dickens on his tomb, because he felt that he had done an enormous amount to raise the status of literature and of literary men. He devoted an enormous amount of energy to the abortive Guild of Literature and Art, which was supposed to be some kind of more than a trades union or mutual benefit society, but a guild, I mean, of as though writers were like medieval artists or something.
He was a hard act to follow. I mean, his success was meteoric, and someone said he's risen like a rocket and he'll fall like a stick, but he didn't. I mean, he rose like a rocket and he stayed up there.
Yes, he did. But after his death, and in the late 19th century, and well into the 20th century, he wasn't seen as a great artist. He was seen as a great popular entertainer. I mean, I suppose this culminates in F.R. Leavis and his notorious Leavis changed his mind later on, but in his book The Great Tradition, where he talks about, it's in the 1940s, isn't it, the genius of Dickens being essentially that of the great entertainer. I suppose this takes us back to the actor thing we were talking about before. But I think it's fairly common that a great and hugely popular artist, a writer especially, after his death, I mean, look what's happened, say, to William Golding. I mean, who won the Nobel Prize, etc., etc. It'd be interesting to see if the new biography by John Carey is going to put his stock up again. But I mean, he went right down, didn't he? And I'm talking about not in popularity and in sales. I mean, Dickens continued to sell in huge numbers and to be read, and as we've just said, to be constantly adapted for stage and screen. But he wasn't, and this is why, after all, I wasn't allowed to study him at Oxford, even as late as the 1950s. Somehow he wasn't quite literature with a capital L. So It's interesting. I don't think he did. I think the idea of the great literary genius, the great literary man, and so on, had much more to do with later writers like Henry James and so on, and later Bloomsbury and Virginia Woolf and so on, and that kind of, and Dickens was regarded then as anything but the great literary artist.